Thanks everybody for coming today, and let me first start with an apology. I realize I'm probably bumping up against 30 minutes late, which I'd hate to do to you, and I've said that before. So anyways, my apologies. Certainly a controversial weekend in our city. I wanted to specifically address police actions at Saturday's protests, and then take any questions you might have, as Amy said, in relation to our approach to protests generally, or perhaps the legal landscape around protests. Let me start by saying that I've heard and completely understand the frustrations of the residents and business community in the Beltline. I know these protests have been going on for an extended period of time, and they have disturbed the peace and quiet in your community and in your homes. As you're likely aware, our officers in one district have been actively engaging with the community and with business owners to communicate the service's approach to dealing with the issues, and also to make sure that we have a good understanding of the pressures and the issues that are arising in the community as these protests evolve. On Saturday, our officers had the very difficult task of managing two separate but related protests that occurred on the streets of downtown Calgary. Before the protests, as we do, officers worked with demonstration organizers in an attempt to identify, manage, mitigate the very real potential for conflict. While the protests have been occurring for some time in our city, there has been an ongoing evolution of causes, reasons, turnouts, locations, and of course, crowd dynamics. While we'd worked to negotiate alternative options and alternative routes with organizers prior to Saturday, ultimately both groups were insistent on their original plans, which we knew would result in them coming together along 17th Avenue Southwest. We had resources and a plan in place to avoid this situation. In the end, our plan to divert the larger group off of 17th Avenue failed when that larger group refused to follow the on-the-ground directions of our officers and to continue to march forward along 17th Avenue. When I say refused to follow the orders or direction of the officers on the ground, what I'm saying is the group literally pushed past the officers that were in that particular location and continued on, which you can appreciate that large groups can do with a small number of officers at a particular point. Notably, very notably, this represents what I would call a marked escalation in the behavior of the Freedom Group, who up to that point had been reasonably cooperative with police during the facilitation of their right to protest over the last many months. I understand that this is the first time they have refused police direction while on the ground engaged in a march or a protest in the community. That is unacceptable. What resulted was two groups coming together in opposing directions on 17th Avenue at around 8th Street in what I would call somewhat of a standoff situation. In response to this, officers on the ground attempted secondary negotiations again with both groups, while our mountain bike unit worked to keep the two growing crowds separate from one another. Over the course of nearly an hour, the groups were stationary, and they remained so at that location. Some members of the group ended up actually moving around off of 17th Avenue and coming around behind the opposing protest group, which certainly increased the potential for hostility. During the time, officers on the ground and the command team did notice an increase in hostilities from both sides of what was really a stationary protest over an extended period of time, not a tenable situation. Officers reported seeing several altercations between the two groups and had to take quick action to prevent escalation, which, without their intervention, was, in their view, inevitable. In essence, one group was determined to block the path of the other and hold their ground. The other group was determined to pass by, and neither group was willing to compromise. Officers were managing what was a large crowd on a busy Saturday afternoon along 17th Avenue, with increasing tensions. What became clear to the incident commanders in charge of the protest for that day was that the stalemate was increasing public safety risk and needed to be resolved. The situation was such that officers were not going to be able to maintain the peace and order without creating what I'll call a pressure relief valve of a tense situation. Trained and experienced incident commanders who have the benefit of aerial views of everything that's going on in the area, including the entire crowd, as well as information from officers on the ground, decided that the most reasonable course of action was to open a pathway around the smaller protest group. While many took this decision as officers choosing sides in the protest, what I can tell you is this was definitely not the case. Police do not take sides, and in particular in a volatile protest situation. This was simply the most effective way to bring this conflict to a conclusion, keeping in mind the risks for public and officer safety. Many have commented on videos posted online of officers pushing individuals back with bikes in order to open that roadway. I want to remind everyone here that officers have a responsibility for the safety of every single person on that street. This is not about choosing sides. Individuals were asked, then told, to move in order to open that roadway. There were individuals who were absolutely resolute and actively resisted not only the verbal direction given by the officers, but their physical efforts to open the road. The goal of CPS is to manage protests and demonstrations in an efficient and collaborative way without the use of force. And generally, this has been achieved, and this has long been our experience in our city due to the good work of an experienced police force. And while any use of force is regrettable, particularly in this situation, police are authorized to use reasonable force to carry out their duties in the broader public interest. Our number one objective during these demonstrations is to ensure the safety of everyone involved, as I've said. That includes the protesters, that includes bystanders or people who may be along 17th Avenue, and it includes our officers. In events such as this, we have officers who are assigned solely to assessing risk levels and evolving crowd behavior. In this situation, the increased volatility and mounting confrontations created significant safety concerns for everyone on the scene, and intervention was necessary. I will reemphasize, police are not supporting any group or any ideology connected to these protests. The role of the police is to manage the crowds and their dynamics and to ensure the safety and security of all involved. Moving forward, we're working with our planners and our legal people internally and also with the province of Alberta to see how best we can adjust our approaches given how our environment has changed this past week. And the change I'm talking about relates to the lack of cooperation from the Freedom Group in walking through our officers who were doing the traffic control. This is a situation where we will want to remain connected with residents and business owners in the Beltline, obviously. There needs to be ongoing dialogue with work and work with our stakeholders. I think that it's very important that I tell you that this is a situation that is very, very complex. It's not likely, in terms of managing expectations, it's not likely to be resolved by this coming Friday. But I can tell you this. In the meantime, I would urge freedom protesters to take into consideration the negative impact that these ongoing protests are having on communities. And consider, given the restrictions being lifted and the state of the situation in Alberta, whether these protests need to continue at this time. The communities could use a break. With respect to community members in the Beltline, as we work this through, and I assure you we will work this through, I would ask and appeal to you not to ramp up your efforts to take over the streets. This increases the risks that are being faced, the volatility that exists for all involved, and certainly has the potential to prompt additional escalation on all sides. That is something that would be in no one's best interest. At this time, I'll stop here and I will turn it over to the group for any questions you might have in relation to what I've said or the protests more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So we will now begin the Q&A portion with members of the media. If you have a question, please type question in the question box now. Jason, I see you have one, so if you want to get started and go ahead with any follow-ups.
Sure. I don't think I was first in line there, but I can take the first stab here. Yeah, one of the things that Mayor Jyoti Gondek said, on the weekend following the protest was she doesn't understand why bylaws aren't being enforced against the Freedom Rally protesters, saying they don't have the proper permits or licenses, calling it a parade. So I put that question to you. Why aren't we seeing bylaw enforcement here?
Thanks, Jason. Good question. So with respect to enforcement of bylaws in relation to protests, there obviously is some tension between the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the supreme law in the country, and then down to municipal bylaws. There has to be consistencies. I can tell you our people are looking at a number of different bylaws that we currently have on the books in the city, and then how those apply to what I would call a new environment in terms of protests. We're historically, quite adept at dealing with, labor strife, union management strife, environmental protests, oil and gas. We've seen those over the years, but we've never really seen an environment with sort of ongoing and sustained protest, which ostensibly are about vaccine mandates and public health restrictions, but really there's also an underlying sort of anti-democratic angle to these as well. So we're looking at how those tensions between the legitimate right to protest, which certainly exists, are balanced against community interests, as we've heard from folks in the Beltline, and where do the activities of the protesters cross over into being an unreasonable infringement. And so that's some of the work we're doing. Obviously, the police are one piece of this, and you can appreciate that we're the most visible piece. Our members are on the front line each weekend and have been for over 2 years. And as a result of that, they understand this landscape well. But you know what? The whole system has to be engaged in terms of the police taking steps around the laying of charges, whether they be municipal bylaws or provincial offenses or whatever. We have to know that the rest of the system, the Crown prosecutors, the courts, are going to follow through. I think thus far, if you think back over the course of the pandemic, we've seen a number of very, very complex situations that actually probably, in my view, went on too long. You think of the situation with, Kevin Johnson as an example. There are others too that led, very, very disruptive protests. And it was in the fullness of time, because of this difficult legal landscape, where there were innovative solutions that were identified. Some of them involve civil court solutions through injunctions and this type of thing. So I think as a society, we've been working our way through sort of a new environment with respect to protest and protest law. And the police have certainly been on the front line. And as we've said, the communities have very much felt the brunt of it.
All right, if I get a follow-up question here, I would like to put to you another statement from the mayor over the weekend, which is the idea that police have kind of allowed these protests to grow into what they have become by not taking stronger enforcement action earlier. And this has kind of, led the Beltline residents who are counter-protesting to believe that this is their only recourse. Looking for your response to that.
Yeah, I would say this is a pernicious issue. It's a very complicated issue, and it's not just a Calgary issue. We've actually seen these protests in other cities in our province, in other provinces in our country, and of course, even internationally. And in many cases, these freedom protests have actually been connected in other places back to Calgary. So what happens elsewhere matters here, if you will. So I have to tell you, I don't think this is a time to be looking to blame somebody. And it sort of feels like the police are being blamed for the fact that these things are going on. I think this is a systems response that's required here, and we should all be supporting one another instead of looking to lay blame as to whose fault these are.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, let's go over to Tyson from CTV for another question.
Hi, Chief. Thanks for taking this question. Just it seems like a bit of a change of tune from Calgary Police. The statement released on Saturday said that a lot of the reasoning behind the tactics used by police was due to opposing protesters, maybe forming an illegal blockade, blocking the street. If you're now saying that the freedom protesters broke the police line, were those tactics of using bikes to stop them from doing so used? It just seems a bit of a change of tune since Saturday.
Well, just to be clear, what I would tell you is this, just backing up in terms of the activities of the protesters. I would say that there's probably a little bit of blame to be shared on both sides. We saw what I would call subversive activity on both sides. So obviously, I've mentioned the freedom protesters walking through the line, and I don't know specifically whether those were bikes that were there at the time or whether those were officers on foot, but nevertheless, they certainly didn't obey, and they certainly walked right through. But I can also tell you that there were different groups of the opposite side, and those individuals there were anticipating, it would seem, that the police plan would be to reroute the freedom group, the larger group, because that's exactly what had been done the week prior. And so we saw sort of forward groups or splinter groups of the counter-protest group also moved up there to around 4th Street in order to try to blockade up there. So I would say that if you're thinking about this in terms of the difficulties posed towards management of this and our officers that are on the ground, we seem to have two groups that, number one, would not cooperate ahead of time. There seemed to be an appetite on both sides to have a conflict. And like I say, I would say that both sides were able to contribute to that. And when I say both sides, I'm not talking about, the homogenous group, because I would suggest to you that both groups are anything but homogenous. We've heard stories that the residents are out there, and these are all residents of the Beltline. That is not the information that I have. I certainly would agree that there's residents of the Beltline and maybe business owners participating due to their frustration, and that would be understandable. But there are also professional protesters out there as well. There are people out there who want to promote conflict here, and they would do anything to get their Kodak moment and to get their post. And that goes for the other side too. I would suggest to you that this was a damned if you do and damned if you don't no win for the police, because the bottom line is, if they ended up having to use any force against the one side, of course, we know how that turned out, right? They're targeting and they're supporting one side and not the other. If there was force used against the other side, which there has been in previous protests too, may I remind you, then we hear that our officers are Nazis and this type of thing, and this gets all over the right side, rebel media and freedom and that sort of thing. So, and that's okay. Nobody is suggesting that, the police shouldn't be subject to that sort of criticism. We all know how that works, but the reality of it is there was no winning on this one. And when you get two groups coming together like this who seem to be pitted on having conflict, there is going to be no win.
And just a quick follow-up, you did say last week the freedom protest is a legal protest. Would you at this point say that the opposing protest that was brought on Saturday is illegal or legal? And just on top of that, hearing from members of city council, does that just fuel the fire when they start putting stuff on social media about how police actions are maybe not enough?
Well, I think it does. I think it's demoralizing for our officers when you're going out there dealing in one of the most complicated legal environments that I have ever seen in 30 years. And I just think that it's been sort of oversimplified by individuals, some of them elected, some of them appointed. And does that fuel the fire? Sure. Do we have counselors that are encouraging people to go out and participate in the protests? Yes, we do. Do I think that's a good idea? No, I don't. At the end of the day, I don't control anybody else, so that's fine. But I can tell you, it's pretty difficult for city employees and police officers to be going out and then seeing themselves being criticized for what they're doing without even so much as a discussion about what's really happened and seeing the big picture. And it's polarizing. I get it. What isn't polarizing in society these days? Virtually everything. And so I just would urge everybody, I think, to be able to just take a step back. It's been a very difficult 2 years for everyone, and let's find a way to work together through this problem. And I think that's how we get there. The notion that we've got to point fingers and blame, we've seen it in other areas and it hasn't worked there, and I suspect it probably won't work here either.
Thanks, Tyson. Adam McVicker, you can go ahead.
Hi, Chief. Thanks for taking my question. I was just wondering what kind of resources are needed to respond to these protests on the weekends, and if there's a cost associated with that to the Calgary Police Service.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Good question. So here's the thing. We have these protests have been increasing in both numbers and intensity over the past couple of years, and we've been very successful at policing these with a reasonably small number of police officers. And the reason why that is because we have enjoyed a relatively high level of cooperation from those involved. And so, like I say, we've been successful, no violence, no property damage, and being able to work with the groups to allow them to protest and trying to minimize impact on the community. I would suggest to you, that seems to have changed. So the number of resources that are going to be required to deal with large crowds, is going to be something that'll be a sliding scale, and we'll have to deal with. So our folks are sort of tabletopping those types of things right now. But yeah, I think, in terms of your question about cost, there is always hard costs to bringing people out on overtime to police the protests. And then there's opportunity costs. There's a lot of officers around and across the city who are brought in from their regular duties. And the opportunity costs there, I think, even though we're paying them anyway to be at work, but the opportunity cost is they're not doing the things that they're assigned to do. So, I think about the mountain bike unit or other members of patrol that are part of the public safety unit. So they're out of their areas, which does have an impact on the types of service that's provided to the community. And that's the opportunity costs that I talk about. I was speaking with Deputy Chief Tofik after the protest, and he was saying, man, if I had the ability to take those resources and put them into communities to deal with crime and other community problems, what kind of a difference could I make? But unfortunately, we don't have that luxury because we're putting them and investing them into protests week after week.
And just a quick follow-up here, I mean, we've seen an escalation between this past weekend and the weekend prior. Is there a concern that that escalation will continue, and what can Calgary Police do if if it turns into a bit more of a violent conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen it in other cities and other countries as well. Australia pops in mind, but I'm thinking even in other protest environments, when we get two groups coming together that are very, very staunchly opposed to one another, and their beliefs and ideologies are completely divergent, in an environment where I think people are frustrated, people are tired, and their nerves are frayed, and we get it. We see it, all of us see it in our own communities, in our own families, and I would suggest that people are just not maybe bringing their best to every situation. And so this is volatile, absolutely. We saw it on Saturday. It was volatile Saturday, and we needed to open that road. And I guess that's what I think is that this is a time for all of us, I think with respect to the Freedom folks, people who protested in the past always kind of considered themselves part of the larger community. So when we're dealing with protest organizers and we're asking, hey, would you look at this route because there's sensitivities over here that don't exist over here? We never experienced issues with that. And I think that's because people did see themselves as part of the larger community and actually didn't want to cause unnecessary negative impact for their neighbors. And I think that's what's missing here. At the end of the day, I understand why folks in the Beltline are pissed off. I get it. But it's interesting that when you talk to people that are coming out into the community, they don't seem to have the same level of, I guess, just respect for people that we would ordinarily have. And when I say things are polarizing, that's what I mean there. So that would be something to step back and just think about, what is the appropriate next step, not getting more positional and polarized. Certainly for residents of the Beltline, I again would just underscore, allow us to work this through, and I commit to you that we will do that, but it gets a lot more complicated and a lot more volatile when we have to manage a face-off. So I'd like to avoid that.
Thanks, Chief. Colette, you can go ahead with your question.
Hi, it's Colette from the Canadian Press. I was just wondering how you might handle that on this coming weekend. Is there going to be more enforcement? It's one thing to appeal to people, but is there going to be more enforcement? Is there going to be changes? Are you going to look at some of the tools that Ottawa used to break up these protests?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Colette. The Ottawa situation was really, I think there was some similarities and some differences. I think the Ottawa situation involved an occupation, and that kind of became quite quickly easily recognizable as an unlawful assembly, and that was unlawful 8 ways from Sunday. I think some of the challenges that they faced there were the fact that there were large rigs in there, and these trucks had come in and occupied the downtown. They weren't able to stop them from doing that, and then they had to deal with it after. I mean, here, our circumstance is a little bit different. And, we've looked at protests in Alberta even, and the circumstances do seem to vary. Here in Calgary, we're talking about, groups that have been bigger and smaller. At different times, they've protested in different locations. I remember that we were unhappy earlier in the pandemic when Prince's Island Park was the one location. At certain other periods of time, and for, reasons that only these folks could explain to you, they were going to places like Chinook Mall and protesting inside when there were public health restrictions on. Now we've seen the movement from Stephen Avenue to a march route over to 17th Avenue. And so this has continued to evolve. We're dealing mostly with people on foot, large crowds of people on foot. And I think at the Edmonton protests, they were dealing with, smaller numbers of people on foot, but I think as high as 680 vehicles. involved, honking horns and this type of thing. So a bit of a different police response required. So I can tell you that we're certainly looking at our response to the situation as it is now, but recognizing that it's been evolving throughout. So we'll need to be agile enough to continue to evolve with it. But I can tell you the greatest challenge in relation to it is that, again, protesting is de facto legal. It's just that fine balance between making sure you're allowing people their charter rights, whether you agree with what they have to say or not, and then dealing with making sure you're balancing off those rights against those of people living in communities like the Beltline.
Just to follow up, but it's my understanding that some people have set up like merchandise booths and food booths and stuff like that in the park without licenses. Is there not a way to enforce those types of things to prevent people from gathering?
Yeah, I suspect there is, Colette, and so that's something we'll look at as well. I guess, what we're sort of seeing there, I suspect, is that when people are gathering at places like Central Memorial Park, there's people who are, the entrepreneurial spirit and capitalism is showing up there, and people are taking their businesses to the people. And, after, or, whether after is the right word, the pandemic, in some ways you can't blame them. Again, the protests have evolved and the locations have evolved and that sort of thing. But I certainly think that if that's an ongoing practice, there is opportunity for us to work with our partners at bylaw. And that would generally be their issue to enforce, but certainly we would help in any way that we could.
Thank you, Colette. So if no one else has any questions, we will conclude the media availability. If you do have a question, just pop it in the chat really quick. Looks like that's everything. So thank you for joining us today. If you need a recording of the live stream, just send a message over through the media line and we will send it over to you. Thank you.